There are weeks in NASCAR that everybody forgets within a few days, and then there are weeks that stay with the sport for a long, long time. This is one of the second kind. Two storylines are dominating conversation in the garage and among fans right now, and they couldn't be more different from each other in tone. One is raw, emotional, and forces a hard look at how we treat people while they're alive versus how we talk about them once they're gone. The other is about stability, business, and a team quietly putting together the pieces for a championship run. Together, they say a lot about where this sport is in this exact moment, how drivers get judged, how organizations plan years ahead, and why the next stretch of this season matters more than usual for a lot of people inside the sport. Let's start with Tony Stewart, because what he said recently has become one of the more talked about moments in NASCAR media this month. Kyle Busch died on May 21st at the age of 41. The cause, according to a statement released by his family, was severe pneumonia that progressed into sepsis, leading to rapid and overwhelming complications. It was a sudden, brutal loss, the kind that doesn't give anyone time to prepare for it, and the kind that hits an entire industry at once. In the weeks since, tributes have poured in from every corner of the sport. Drivers who raced against him for 2 decades, team owners, broadcasters, mechanics, and millions of fans have all tried to put into words what Kyle Busch meant to NASCAR. People have talked about his intensity, his bluntness, his sense of humor away from the cameras, and the staggering scope of what he accomplished, more combined wins across NASCAR's top 3 national series than anyone in the sport's history. But Tony Stewart didn't want to talk about any of that. Not in the way everyone expected, anyway. Speaking to reporters ahead of an NHRA event in Bristol, Tennessee, Stewart was asked the question everybody gets asked in moments like this: how should Kyle Busch be remembered? And instead of offering a polished tribute, Stewart pushed back on the entire framing of the question. His point in plain terms was this: a lot of people are only now, after Kyle is gone, talking about what kind of person he actually was. And that timing bothered him. If you've followed this sport for any length of time, you probably know exactly what Stewart is getting at. Kyle Busch was never a driver who tried to be universally liked. He didn't smooth over his emotions for the cameras. He raced hard, he said what he thought, and he didn't apologize for either one. That made him one of the most polarizing figures the sport has ever produced. Some fans were die-hard supporters from his first lap in a cup car. Others couldn't stand him no matter what he did. There was very little middle ground, and Busch never seemed all that interested in creating any. Tony Stewart understands that dynamic on a personal level because he lived through a version of it himself. Stewart built his entire reputation on intensity. He was blunt, competitive to a fault, and unwilling to fake a personality he didn't have just to make reporters or fans more comfortable. That shared experience is probably why his comments about Busch felt less like a generic tribute and more like something he genuinely needed to say. Stewart's argument was straightforward. People who wanted to understand who Kyle Busch really was had 2 decades to do that while he was alive and competing every single weekend. Waiting until after his death to start talking about his generosity, his humor, or his loyalty to people in the garage misses the point, in Stewart's view. He wasn't asking people to pretend Busch was a different person than the one they saw on TV. He was asking why it took losing him for so many people to look past the television persona at all. And it's worth remembering just how much history existed between these two men. Stewart and Busch raced against each other in the Cup Series from 2005 all the way through 2016. For one season, 2008, they were actually teammates at Joe Gibbs Racing, right before Stewart left to start his own team. They had their share of friction on track too. There was an incident in Las Vegas in 2006 where Busch wrecked Stewart during a race. A few years later, in 2009 at Daytona, Stewart returned the favor, sending Busch into the wall on the final lap. These were two men who fought hard against each other for over a decade. They weren't friends in the soft, sentimental sense. But underneath the competition, there was a mutual respect that only people who've actually raced wheel to wheel against someone for years can really understand. What makes Stewart's comments land so hard is that he wasn't trying to deliver a eulogy or paint a complete picture of who Busch was. He specifically avoided doing that. His message wasn't, "Let me tell you who Kyle really was." His message was, "You had the chance to find that out yourselves, and a lot of you didn't take it." It's a tough thing to sit with, honestly. How many of us have judged a driver based on one radio outburst caught on a hot mic? How many opinions have been built entirely around a single heated post-race interview, with zero context about what led up to it? It's easy to forget that the people strapped into these cars every weekend are dealing with pressure, scrutiny, and expectations most of us never have to face, and that the version of them we see in a 30-second clip is rarely the whole story. Whatever anyone's personal opinion of Kyle Busch was over the years, there's no disputing the size of the hole his death has left in this sport. And it's clear, based on how Stewart responded to that question in Bristol, that this loss hit him in a deeply personal way. It's also worth noting that Stewart hasn't stepped away from racing entirely since retiring from full-time Cup competition. He stayed busy in NHRA events and other forms of motorsport, and earlier this year he actually returned to a NASCAR truck for the first time since 2016, driving for Kyle Busch's own truck team at Daytona. Not long after Busch's passing, Stewart was seen at an NHRA event in Maryland wearing a hat with Busch's number on it, a small gesture, but one that said a lot about how much this loss meant to him personally. Now let's shift gears completely, because the second big story this week is about something a lot more forward-looking, and it centers on RFK Racing. Chris Buescher has signed a new multi-year contract extension to keep driving the number 17 Ford for RFK Racing. On the surface, that might not sound like the biggest headline of the year. But when you dig into the context, this might be one of the smartest, most low-key important moves the organization has made in years. Buescher is 33 years old now, but his relationship with this organization, in its earlier form as Roush Fenway Racing, goes back much further than a lot of casual fans probably realize. He entered the Roush developmental pipeline all the way back in 2009. Since then he's worked his way up methodically. He won the NASCAR Xfinity Level Championship back in 2015, and he's now closing in on 400 career Cup Series starts. Across his career, he's picked up 6 Cup Series wins, 5 of which came specifically while driving for this organization. Since taking over the number 17 full-time back in 2020, Buescher has slowly built a reputation as one of the most dependable, professional drivers in the entire garage. Not flashy, not constantly in headlines for the wrong reasons, just consistently good. And this season is reinforcing exactly that reputation. With 10 races left before the playoffs begin, Buescher currently sits 7th in the championship standings. Just as importantly, he's the only driver from RFK Racing currently inside the playoff cutoff line. That's a significant detail. It means the organization's entire postseason hope, at least for now, runs through one driver and one car. Look at where RFK Racing was several years ago compared to where it stands today, and Buescher's fingerprints are all over that improvement. He's been responsible for 5 of the team's last 6 Cup Series victories. Back in 2023, he won 3 races in a single season, the first Roush-affiliated driver to do that since Matt Kenseth managed it more than a decade earlier. That's not just a hot streak. That's sustained, elite-level performance from a driver who doesn't always get the national attention some of his rivals do. In comments about the extension, Buescher described this organization as essentially his racing home, the place where he spent the majority of his career, and a place he's genuinely proud to have helped build. He talked about his confidence in the direction the team is heading, the people working alongside him, and the shared commitment toward winning at the highest level. Jack Roush, RFK Racing's co-owner and founder, had high praise for Buescher as well, not just for what he does behind the wheel, but for how he represents the team and the sport more broadly. Roush pointed specifically to Buescher's work ethic, his intelligence as a racer, and his overall dedication as the reasons the organization wanted to lock him in for the long haul. Brad Keselowski, his teammate, was even more direct in his praise. He described Buescher as essentially everything you'd want in a teammate: professional, well-prepared, and genuinely invested in helping the people around him improve, not just himself. Coming from a former champion and current co-owner, that's a meaningful endorsement. Put simply, this extension sends a clear signal. RFK Racing isn't just keeping Buescher around for next season. They're building their long-term championship plans with him as one of the foundational pieces. Given his track record and his current form, it's genuinely hard to argue with that strategy. So when you step back and look at both of these stories side by side, they really do represent 2 very different sides of this sport. One is about legacy, about how a driver gets remembered about the uncomfortable gap that sometimes exists between how someone is perceived in the moment and how they're appreciated only in hindsight. Tony Stewart's comments about Kyle Busch weren't really about settling old scores or polishing an image. They were about challenging the timing of when people choose to actually pay attention to who somebody is. The other story is about the future, about an organization making a calculated bet on stability, consistency, and a driver who's quietly become indispensable to their playoff hopes. Chris Buescher's extension with RFK Racing isn't a flashy headline. It's a foundational one, the kind of decision that shapes where a team is in 3 or 4 years, not just this weekend. Both stories, in their own way, are reminders that there's a lot more happening in this sport than what shows up in the highlight reel. There's history, there's loyalty, there's grief, and there's long-term strategy all playing out at the same time, often in the same week. That's part of what makes following NASCAR right now so compelling. These aren't isolated headlines. They're threads in a much bigger story about where this sport has been and where it's heading.